Stay, don't leave. The voice was quiet, controlled, but it didn't sound like a request. It sounded like gravity deciding something for him. And Ethan Cole, who had spent most of his life fixing systems no one cared about, suddenly realized an entire royal chamber was watching him like he had just rewritten the rules of existence. Which was concerning because 30 seconds ago the same room had been preparing for a ceremonial transfer of power, the kind that happens when a queen doesn't get back up, the kind everyone had already accepted. And now Queen Soraya was standing, not fully steady but undeniably alive, her hand still wrapped around his wrist like letting go might undo whatever had just happened. The air itself seemed to hesitate, like the station wasn't sure whether to resume normal function or keep holding its breath. Ethan cleared his throat, which felt inappropriate, but also necessary. I wasn't planning on going anywhere, he said, because humor had always been his way of negotiating with situations that were clearly above his pay grade. No one laughed, which felt fair. The last thing they had seen was their queen's vitals dropping into a pattern every physician in 3-star systems had already agreed was irreversible. And then a human technician with a worn-out toolkit and a questionable sense of timing had stepped forward and done something that none of their advanced systems had even attempted. He hadn't replaced anything, hadn't overridden anything. He had simply rerouted it. Like the problem wasn't failure but miscommunication, like the queen's body wasn't shutting down, just being misunderstood, which sounded ridiculous until the monitors responded, one by one. Like lights turning back on in a building everyone thought was abandoned. Ethan had noticed the pattern first, buried under layers of elegant alien design, a rhythm that didn't belong, something oddly familiar, not alien at all, more like a cross-species echo, and he had followed it, ignoring the polite but firm suggestions to step away, ignoring the way security had shifted just slightly closer, because sometimes the difference between a bad idea and the only idea is timing, and his timing, for once, had been perfect. Now Queen Soraya's eyes were on him, not scanning, not assessing, just fixed, like she had found something she wasn't supposed to find again. Her ears angled forward, a subtle shift that seemed to ripple through the room more than any alarm had. You understood it, she said softly, more to herself than to him. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. I wouldn't go that far. I just guessed aggressively, which earned him a few looks that suggested aggressive guessing was not an approved medical methodology. Somewhere behind him, one of the system cores emitted a soft chime, not an alarm, not a warning, more like a confirmation, the kind systems reserved for results they didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, then back at the queen. So, are you feeling okay? He asked, because that felt like the most normal question available. Even if nothing about this was normal, Queen Soraya didn't answer. Right away, her grip tightened just slightly, not enough to hurt, just enough to anchor, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried through the chamber with effortless authority. You saved my life, she said, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. Ethan exhaled slowly. Yeah, well, I fixed things, he replied, and for a fraction of a second, something in her expression shifted, not quite a smile, not quite softness, but something close enough to matter. And then, without looking away from him, she added, then you will stay. And the way she said it made Ethan realize this wasn't a suggestion, and somewhere deep within the system, something else had just started waking up. No one moved, not because they were ordered to, but because movement suddenly felt like it might break something fragile and important. The kind of silence that carries weight instead of emptiness settled over the chamber as the system lights shifted into a steady, almost thoughtful glow, and Ethan became very aware that Queen Soraya still had not released his wrist, which felt less like restraint and more like confirmation. Like she was making sure he was real. Behind him a senior physician finally found his voice, though it came out quieter than expected. Your Majesty, your vitals have stabilized beyond projected parameters, which was a careful way of saying this should not be happening. Soraya did not look away from Ethan. I am aware, she replied, her tone calm, controlled, and absolute, the kind of voice that made disagreement feel like a theoretical concept rather than an option. Ethan shifted slightly, not pulling away, just adjusting his balance. For the record, I would like it noted that I did not override anything, he said, mostly to the room. partly to himself. I just connected a few things that were not talking to each other. A murmur moved through the chamber, quiet but sharp, the kind of reaction that spreads when experts realize a solution existed outside their framework. One of the council members stepped forward, his posture rigid with authority and discomfort. Human, the system you accessed is restricted to royal genetic interfaces. Ethan blinked once. That sounds like something I probably should have been told before I touched it, he said, which did not improve the atmosphere. The man's expression tightened. It should not have responded to you at all. Ethan glanced back at the softly pulsing console, then at his own hands as if they might offer an explanation. Well, it did, he said simply. Because there was not a more sophisticated version of that sentence. Soraya's grip shifted, not loosening, just changing angle, her fingers sliding slightly as if testing the shape of his presence. It responded because he understood the pattern, she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the rising tension. Not the code, not the structure, the pattern. Her ears angled forward again, a subtle but unmistakable signal that every alien in the room seemed to interpret immediately. The council member hesitated, recalibrating his argument in real time. Understanding does not grant access, he insisted. Quieter now, Soraya finally turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him without breaking the line between her and Ethan. It does now, she said, and the conversation ended, not with agreement, but with the absence of further resistance. Ethan exhaled slowly. I feel like I accidentally changed a policy, he muttered. A faint sound somewhere between a suppressed laugh and disbelief escaped from one of the technicians near the back. Quickly silenced when several guards glanced in that direction, the system chimed again, louder this time, not an alert, but a sequence. As if something deeper had been activated, the main display shifted, data reorganizing itself with a smoothness that suggested intent. Rather than automation, lines of unfamiliar symbols resolved into a format even Ethan could follow. And then, in clear translated text, a single designation appeared, compatibility alignment detected. The words hung in the air, simple, precise, and profoundly unwelcome to anyone who preferred their universe predictable. Ethan stared at the display, then back at Soraya. Okay, that feels important, he said carefully. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable but not distant. If anything, closer, more focused, like she had narrowed the entire room down to a single variable. It is, she said, and for the first time, there was something beneath her composure that resembled certainty rather than control, the kind of certainty that does not ask permission. You will remain, she continued, her voice lowering just slightly, enough that it felt directed at him alone despite the dozens of witnesses. Ethan let out a quiet breath, half amusement, half disbelief. I am starting to get that impression, he replied, and somewhere deep within the system, another layer unlocked, silent, precise, and waiting. The chamber did not return to normal. It simply adjusted around a new reality that no one had prepared for, the kind of shift that did not announce itself loudly, but instead settled into every surface, every system, every pair of eyes that now refused to look away from a human who was never supposed to matter. Ethan became aware that the guards had subtly repositioned, not aggressively, not threateningly, just closer, as if the definition of what needed protection had quietly expanded to include him, which felt like an administrative error he did not remember. Filing. He glanced once more at the display. The words compatibility alignment detected remained steady, unblinking, like a fact that had no interest in being debated. That is not a normal message, right? He asked, keeping his voice low enough to feel conversational and not like he was addressing an entire royal court. One of the technicians swallowed before answering, No, it is not, which was reassuring in the least reassuring way possible. Queen Soraya finally released his wrist, but only to take a half step closer, the distance between them now deliberate rather than accidental. Her presence carried a kind of quiet gravity that made space reorganize itself, not physically, but socially. People shifted, attention narrowed, priorities rearranged. Ethan resisted the urge to step back, mostly because something told him that would be interpreted as a decision, and he was not ready to make any decisions that might accidentally become law. You accessed a system bound to the royal line, Soraya said, her tone even, But there was a thread of something else beneath it now. Not suspicion, not doubt. Something more precise. Curiosity sharpened into intent. Ethan nodded slowly. In my defense, it did not come with a warning label, he said, which earned him a brief flicker of movement from her ears, a small, almost imperceptible shift that suggested the comment had landed somewhere unexpected. Behind them, the council had begun speaking again, quietly, urgently, the kind of low conversation people have when they believe control can still be recovered through discussion. Ethan caught fragments, unauthorized access, biological impossibility, system error, words that sounded confident but felt increasingly fragile in the presence of a result they could not undo. Soraya did not acknowledge them. Her focus remained entirely on him. The system did not reject you, she said. It recognized you. Ethan exhaled slowly. Those feel like very different problems, he replied. She studied his face as if looking for something beyond expression, something deeper, something older. Not problems, she said softly. Answers. The words settled between them with more weight than it should have, as if it carried implications neither of them had fully unpacked yet. The main display shifted again, additional data unfolding in layered sequences, genetic markers, resonance patterns, compatibility metrics, none of which meant much to Ethan except for the way the room reacted to them. The silence returned, sharper this time. Not confusion, but realization. A guard near the far wall straightened. Another lowered his gaze entirely. The council's quiet discussion stopped mid-sentence, like someone had reached into the conversation and removed its ability to continue. Ethan followed their attention back to the display and felt his stomach drop just slightly. Not fear, more like the moment before understanding something inconvenient. Okay, he said carefully. I am starting to think this is bigger than a medical fix. Soraya's expression did not change, but something in her posture did. A subtle alignment, a decision settling into place. It is, she said, and then, with absolute clarity, you are not here by accident. Ethan let out a small breath that might have been a laugh if the situation had been even slightly normal. I would love for that to be less true, he said, but the system behind her pulsed again, brighter now, as if disagreeing, and somewhere deep within the station, a locked protocol finished opening, waiting for a command that had already been decided. The system did not ask for confirmation. It simply continued, as if it had been waiting for this exact sequence of events for longer than anyone in the room was comfortable admitting. The display shifted once more, and this time it did not present data. It presented a directive, not in words at first, but in structure, a cascade of authorization layers unlocking in precise succession, each one more restricted than the last. Each one responding to something Ethan had not intentionally provided. He leaned slightly closer, squinting at the interface like that might make it less significant. I am going to assume that is not supposed to happen without a password, he said quietly. One of the senior technicians let out a breath that sounded almost like defeat. There is no password for that level, he replied. Only lineage. The words settled into the air with the kind of finality that made speculation feel unnecessary. Ethan straightened slowly, glancing at his hands again as if they might have changed in the last 10 seconds. Right, he murmured. That feels like something I should have been briefed on at some point. Queen Soraya stepped closer, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with a certainty that made the movement feel inevitable, her presence now directly in front of him. Close enough that the rest of the chamber faded slightly at the edges, not disappearing, just less relevant. Her gaze held his with a focus that was no longer just curiosity. It was recognition layered with something deeper, something older than the moment. The system is aligning, she said, her voice steady. But there was a subtle shift beneath it, a quiet gravity that carried through the room. It does not do that without cause. Ethan gave a small nod, because arguing with a system he had just accidentally activated seemed like a poor strategy. I am starting to notice a pattern, he said, attempting a light tone that did not quite land in a room that had collectively decided this was not light. Behind them, one of the council members stepped forward again, this time more cautiously, as if approaching a phenomenon rather than a person. Your Majesty, if this alignment is confirmed, it will trigger ancient protocols, he said, choosing each word carefully. Protocols that have not been invoked in centuries. Soraya did not look at him. Then perhaps it is time they were, she replied, and the quiet certainty in her voice ended the discussion before it could fully begin. Ethan blinked once. I am hearing a lot of phrases like ancient and not used in centuries, and I just want to clarify that none of this was on my schedule today, he said, which earned him another flicker of movement from her ears. Subtle, controlled, but undeniably there. The system pulsed again. Brighter now, and the main display resolved into a new sequence, not diagnostic, not analytical, but declarative, the kind of output that does not describe what is happening but what will happen next. A single line formed, clear, unmistakable, royal bond protocol ready for initiation. The words hung in the air, and this time no one spoke at all, not even quietly, because this was no longer a question of interpretation. This was a decision waiting to be acknowledged. Ethan stared at the display, then slowly turned his head back toward Soraya. Okay, he said, very calmly. That sounds important in a way that affects me directly. She held his gaze, and for the first time since she had awakened, there was something unmistakable in her expression, not just control, not just authority, but intent, focused and unwavering. It does, she said, her voice lowering slightly, not softer, just more precise. It recognizes a bond that predates this moment. Ethan let out a quiet breath. That is impressive, considering I only got here about 12 hours ago, he replied, but the system did not dim, did not hesitate. If anything, it seemed to wait, like a held breath expecting completion. Soraya lifted her hand slightly, not touching him this time, just hovering for a fraction of a second as if measuring the space between them. Then she spoke, not to the room, not to the council, but to him. You will remain, she said again, but this time it carried something more than instruction, something closer to claim, and as the system pulsed in response, brighter than before, Ethan realized with a quiet, dawning clarity that whatever this was, it had already moved past the point of being optional. The room did not recover. It adapted, and Ethan was beginning to understand that adaptation here did not mean returning to what things were before. It meant accepting what things had become. The display remained steady with its quiet, undeniable declaration, royal bond protocol ready for initiation, and no one in the chamber seemed willing to be the first to pretend it was not there. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, careful, measured, like he was standing on something that might react if he moved too quickly. So just to be clear, he said, his voice calm but carrying enough to be heard. When a system says something like that, is there usually a manual override, or do we just let it happen? No one answered immediately, which felt like an answer. Queen Syrah studied him with that same focused stillness, her gaze not searching anymore but settling, as if a question had already been resolved internally. There is no override, she said, not dramatically, not forcefully, simply stating a fact that did not require emphasis. Ethan nodded once. That tracks with how today has been going, he replied quietly. A few of the technicians exchanged brief glances, the kind that carried both disbelief and reluctant acceptance behind them. The council had gone completely silent now, not even attempting quiet discussion, because whatever influence they held did not seem to extend into whatever this was. The system pulsed again, softer this time, but more insistent, like a reminder rather than a trigger. Ethan glanced at it, then back at Soraya. And this protocol, he continued carefully. What exactly does it do? The question hung in the air, simple, reasonable, and somehow the most complicated thing anyone could have asked. Soraya took a small step closer, closing the last of the distance between them without urgency, without hesitation, her presence steady and undeniable. It formalizes what the system has already recognized, she said, her voice low, precise. It binds. The word was quiet, but it carried through the chamber with absolute clarity. Ethan let out a slow breath. Bind is a strong word, he said, attempting to keep the tone light, but even. He could hear the shift underneath it. This was no longer a situation he could reduce to a technical problem. The system chimed again, and this time the lights along the chamber walls responded, dimming slightly as if to draw focus toward the center, toward them. Ethan noticed it. The way the environment itself was beginning to align with whatever was happening, like the station was no longer just observing but participating. That feels intentional, he murmured. Soraya's expression did not change, But there was something in her eyes now, something unmistakable, not just authority, not just certainty, something closer to decision reaching its final form. "It is," she said, and then, after a brief pause that felt heavier than anything before it, "And so am I." Ethan blinked once, processing that, because there was a difference between a system making a declaration and a queen choosing to agree with it, and he was starting to realize that both were happening at the same time. Behind him, one of the senior advisors finally stepped forward, more carefully than before, as if approaching a line that could not be uncrossed once reached. "Your Majesty, this action would have implications," he said, the word implications doing a remarkable amount of work in a single sentence. Soraya did not look away from Ethan. "Everything does," she replied calmly. And that was the end of that. The advisor stopped, not because he had nothing more to say, but because there was nowhere for the conversation to go. Ethan exhaled slowly, a small, almost disbelieving sound escaping him. "I was supposed to recalibrate a diagnostic array today," he said, mostly to himself. That was the plan. The system pulsed once more, brighter now, as if responding to the acknowledgement. The display shifted, not changing the message, but emphasizing it, like it was moving from suggestion to inevitability. Ethan looked at it, then back at Soraya, and for the first time, he did not try to deflect with humor. "And if I say no?" he asked quietly. The room held its breath again, not in anticipation, but in recognition that this question mattered in a way none of the others had. Soraya's gaze did not waver, not even slightly, and when she answered, her voice was calm, steady, and absolute. "You will not," she said, not as a threat, not as pressure, but as certainty, and somehow that made it more final than anything else that had happened so far. The certainty in her voice did not fade. It settled, like something that had always been true and had simply been waiting for the moment to be spoken out loud. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer than felt safe, not because he was challenging her, but because he was trying to understand what kind of person says something like that without hesitation, and more importantly, what kind of situation makes it correct. He exhaled slowly, a quiet, steady breath. "That is a very confident prediction," he said, his tone calm, almost conversational, but there was a subtle shift now, less deflection, more engagement, because ignoring this was no longer an option. Queen Soraya did not react to the comment in any visible way, but something in her posture adjusted, a slight alignment, as if she had just confirmed something internal rather than external. "It is not a prediction," she replied, her voice even. "It is recognition." The word landed differently. This time, heavier, more specific, as if it was no longer about the system or the protocol, but about him. Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering that. "Of what exactly?" he asked, and for the first time since the system had begun its quiet escalation, the room felt like it was waiting for an answer that did not come from a machine. Soraya's eyes remained on his, unwavering. But there was a shift beneath the surface now, not softness, not quite, but something less distant, something that acknowledged his question as more than procedural, of something that was already in place, she said, choosing the words with precision. "Long before you walked into this chamber." Ethan let out a small breath that might have been a laugh if it had been less complicated. "That is impressive, considering I did not know I was supposed to be part of anything before about 12 hours ago," he said. But even as he spoke, he could feel it, the way the system behind her pulsed in quiet agreement. The way the room itself seemed to have shifted its expectations around him, like he had been reclassified without consent. Behind them, the main display updated again, not dramatically, not urgently, just a continuation. The royal bond protocol remained ready, but now additional parameters began to populate beneath it. Compatibility confirmed, lineage anomaly detected, cross-species resonance stable. Each line appearing with the same calm authority, like statements that did not require approval. Ethan glanced back at the display, then at Soraya. "I am not an expert," he said slowly. "But that last one sounds like something that should not be stable." A faint flicker passed through her expression. Not disagreement, not concern, more like acknowledgement. "It should not be," she said, and for a moment, that was the most honest thing anyone in the room had said all day. The silence returned, not empty, but full, heavy with implications no one had the language to comfortably address. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, a familiar gesture in an increasingly unfamiliar situation. Okay, he said quietly. So we have a system that thinks this is normal, and a room full of people who do not. He paused, glancing around briefly before returning his attention to her. And you, he added, seem completely fine with that. Soraya held his gaze, and this time, there was no ambiguity in her answer. I am not fine with it, she said, her voice steady, controlled. I am certain of it. And that difference, subtle as it was, changed the weight of everything. Ethan nodded slowly, processing that, because certainty without hesitation was not something he encountered often, especially not directed at him. The system pulsed again, brighter, more insistent now, the chamber lights responding in quiet synchronization, and Ethan realized with a slow, dawning clarity that whatever this protocol was, it was no longer waiting for agreement. It was waiting for completion. He looked back at the display, then at Soraya, and this time there was no humor in his voice when he spoke. And what happens when it finishes? He asked. The question simple, direct, unavoidable. The room stilled once more. Every person present aware that the answer mattered in a way none of them could interrupt. Soraya stepped just slightly closer, close enough now that there was no space left to interpret distance. Her voice low, precise, and final. Then it will no longer be a question, she said, and the system behind her pulsed in perfect alignment with her words, as if it had been waiting for that exact moment to move forward. The system did not surge forward all at once. It advanced in measured steps, like it understood that what it was doing required precision rather than force. The display shifted again, the phrase Royal Bond Protocol ready for initiation dissolving into a structured sequence that began to count, not in numbers, but in phases. Phase 1 acknowledged, Phase 2 aligning. Each transition marked by a soft chime that carried further than sound should have in a room that quiet. Ethan watched it happen with the distinct awareness that he was no longer observing a process, he was inside it. That feels like a countdown without the courtesy of actual numbers, he said, his voice steady but lower now, more focused, because something about the way the system moved suggested it was no longer waiting for input. Queen Soraya remained exactly where she was, her presence unwavering, her attention fixed on him rather than the display, as if the system was secondary to something already decided. It is not counting down, she said calmly. It is aligning what already exists. Ethan glanced at her, then back at the unfolding sequence. I feel like that is a very optimistic interpretation of something that looks extremely official, he replied. But the system continued without pause, the chamber lights dimming further, narrowing the world down to a single focal point. Him, her, and the space between them, behind them. The council did not attempt to intervene this time, not because they agreed, but because they had reached the edge of their authority and found nothing beyond it. One of the technicians took a step back, not in fear, but in recognition that whatever was happening no longer required their involvement. Ethan became aware of the subtle shift in the air, not a physical change, but something perceptual, like the room had decided to pay attention in a different way. This is where I usually ask if there is a safe way to pause this, he said, half to himself, half to the situation. Soraya's gaze did not waver. There is not, she replied, and there was no resistance in her voice, only acceptance. The system chimed again, and this time the display resolved into a new directive. Bond confirmation imminent. The words were simple, precise, and completely uninterested in debate. Ethan let out a slow breath, his mind catching up with the moment in pieces rather than all at once. Imminent is one of those words that does not leave a lot of room for scheduling. Conflicts, he said quietly. Soraya's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough, a slight softening at the edges, not weakness, not hesitation, just a recognition that his attempt at humor was not entirely misplaced. You are concerned, she observed, not as a question. Ethan nodded once. I like to understand the consequences of things before they happen, he said, which felt like a reasonable preference in most situations. The system pulsed again, brighter, closer to completion. The phases narrowing, compressing, like a process reaching its final step. Soraya moved then, not abruptly, not forcefully, just enough to close the last fraction of distance, her hand lifting once more, but this time she did not hesitate. her fingers resting lightly against his. Not gripping, not restraining, simply connecting. The contact was brief, controlled, but it carried more weight than any command she had given. The consequence, she said quietly, her voice lower now, more personal, though still carrying the authority of everything she was, is that you will no longer stand outside this. Ethan looked down briefly at the point of contact, then back at her, the humor still there, but quieter now, more contained. I was not aware I was standing outside anything to begin with, he replied. The system chimed again, sharper this time. Final, the display resolving into its last state. Confirmation threshold reached. The chamber lights held, the air stilled, and for a moment, everything paused, not because it had to, but because something was about to change in a way that could not be reversed. Ethan felt it before he understood it, the shift from possibility to reality, from question to answer, and as he met Soraya's gaze, he realized that she had already accepted it long before the system had caught up. The moment did not arrive with noise, it arrived with certainty. The system did not flash or surge, it simply completed. The display shifted one final time, and the words that replaced everything else were unmistakable. Bond confirmed. There was no emphasis, no decoration, just a statement so absolute it removed the possibility of doubt. And for a second, nothing in the room moved. Not the council, not the guards, not even the faint ambient systems that had been quietly adjusting themselves around the event. It was as if the entire station had paused to acknowledge that something irreversible had just taken place. Ethan exhaled slowly, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to feel the difference between before and after. Well, he said quietly, that feels official. His voice carried just enough to break the silence without shattering it. Queen Soraya did not look at the display. She looked at him, her gaze steady, unwavering, but no longer searching. Whatever question had been there before was gone, replaced by something far more definitive. Recognition had become claim, and claim had become fact. Her hand remained lightly against his, not gripping, not holding him in place, just present, as if the connection itself was now something acknowledged rather than enforced. It is done, she said, her voice calm, controlled, and final. The words settled through the chamber with more weight than any declaration before it, because this one did not describe what would happen, it described what already had. Ethan glanced once at the display again, just to confirm that it had not changed its mind in the last few seconds. It had not. The system remained steady, uninterested in reconsideration. I feel like there should be paperwork, he said, more out of instinct than humor. A faint shift passed through Soraya's expression, not quite a smile, but something close enough to register. There will be, she replied, and for the first time, there was a subtle trace of something almost human in her tone, something that acknowledged the absurdity of formality following something this absolute. Behind them, the silence finally fractured, not loudly, not chaotically, but in controlled, restrained movement. The council did not argue. They recalibrated. Advisors exchanged brief, measured looks. Guards adjusted their positions not toward Ethan, but around him, subtle but unmistakable. The shift from outsider to center had completed itself without ceremony. Ethan noticed it, the way space was being redefined in real time, the way attention no longer questioned his presence but adjusted to it. That is new, he murmured, glancing at the repositioned guards. Soraya followed his gaze briefly, then returned her attention to him. They are not reacting, she said. They are acknowledging. Ethan let out a small breath. I preferred reacting, he replied quietly, because reacting implied uncertainty, and uncertainty felt safer than whatever this was. The system pulsed once more, softer now, no longer initiating, no longer building, simply maintaining. As if it had completed its purpose and transitioned into observation, a new line of text appeared beneath the confirmation, secondary protocol pending. The words were smaller, less immediate, but somehow more unsettling. Ethan noticed it instantly, because of course there was a secondary protocol. There was always something after the thing you thought was the end. And that, he said, nodding slightly toward the display, feels like the part where things get more complicated. Soraya's gaze shifted briefly to the new line, then back to him, and this time there was no hesitation in her answer. It is the part where things become clear, she said, her voice low, precise, and carrying a quiet certainty that felt far more dangerous than confusion. Ethan looked at her for a moment longer, then back at the display, the words secondary protocol pending holding steady, waiting, and he had the distinct feeling that whatever came next was not going to ask for his permission, any more than the last part had. He exhaled slowly, a quiet acceptance settling in. Right, he said under his breath. Of course there is a next step, and somewhere deep within the system, something else began to move, not loudly, not urgently, but with the same calm inevitability that had brought them here in the first place. The system did not rush the next step, it unfolded it, like something carefully designed to be understood only when the moment was right. The words secondary protocol pending did not change immediately, they simply remained, steady and patient, as if waiting for recognition rather than input. Ethan studied the display for a second longer than necessary, then looked back at Soraya. I get the feeling this part is not optional either, he said quietly, his tone no longer resisting the situation, just tracking it. She held his gaze, and for the first time there was a subtle shift that did not come from authority, but from something quieter, something closer to acknowledgement of what he was processing. No, she said. It is not. The answer was simple, but it carried less weight than before. Not because it mattered less, but because the outcome had already been accepted. Behind them, the system pulsed again, softer now, more controlled, and the display updated with deliberate clarity. Secondary protocol initiated, the chamber lights adjusted in response, not dimming further, but stabilizing, like the environment had reached a state it intended to maintain. Ethan let out a slow breath. That is usually the part where things either get better or significantly more complicated, he said, glancing briefly around the room. The council was no longer reacting. They were observing, their posture controlled, their silence intentional, because whatever influence they had once held over the situation had been replaced by something older, something built into the system itself. Soraya stepped slightly closer again, not to close distance, but to stand aligned with him rather than in front of him. A subtle but important shift, her presence no longer blocking his path, but defining it. It clarifies, she said, her voice low, precise, what this bond requires. Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering that sounds like a list, he replied, and for a moment, there was the faintest trace of something almost like amusement in her expression, quickly controlled, but real enough to register. The system chimed once more, and the display shifted into a structured sequence, not data, not analysis, but designation, status updated, royal partner designation confirmed. The words appeared without hesitation, without transition, as if they had always been. They're waiting for visibility. The room did not react loudly. It did not need to. The silence itself changed, not tense, not uncertain, but settled, like something had found its final shape. Ethan stared at the display for a long second, then let out a quiet breath. That is very specific, he said, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that had not been there before, because this was no longer abstract. Soraya turned her head slightly toward the council, not fully, just enough to acknowledge their presence, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the chamber with effortless authority. It is recognized, she said, and that was all. No explanation, no justification, just a statement that redefined the room. One of the advisors lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. Others followed, not all at once, but in a quiet sequence that spread through the chamber, a ripple of acceptance that did not need to be commanded. Ethan noticed it, the way the reaction moved, the way the system and the people aligned in the same direction. Okay, he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. That feels like it is going to come with responsibilities. Soraya looked back at him, and this time there was no distance left in her expression, no separation between queen and system and decision. It does, she said, and you will not carry them alone. The words were quiet, but they carried something different than before, not command, not certainty, something closer to promise. Ethan met her gaze, holding it for a moment, then nodded once, not fully understanding, but no longer resisting, because whatever this was, it had already moved beyond the point where resistance mattered. The system pulsed one final time, softer than all the others, and then settled completely, no longer initiating, no longer progressing, simply present, as if it had completed its purpose and transitioned into something else entirely. And as the chamber adjusted to the new reality, Ethan realized that this was not the end of the process. It was the beginning of something that had been waiting for him long before he ever knew it existed.